Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. We start by meeting Melville. He's a young writer in search of information about an old whaling ship that encountered a great white sperm whale. He wants to write his next book about this legend that many talked about, but no one knew for sure what happened. Melville goes to the home of Thomas Nickerson, one of the whalers who was on the Essex ship, as one of the few survivors of the disaster. Thomas is his last hope to get accounts of the story. Arriving at the inn very late at night, he is greeted by the wife of the former whaler. The couple seems to live there and, after getting permission to enter, he finds Thomas already quite old. The writer offers a large sum of money just to get the old whaler to tell his story, but the old man wouldn't yield so easily. Traumatized by the events, he dismisses the writer without paying attention to his proposal. So it's Mrs. Nickerson who has to convince Melville to insist a little more. She explains that her husband never told anyone about this voyage, not even her, but that he needed to unload. It would be good if the writer could get some information from him. After a few more attempts, Melville convinces Thomas to tell his story, which happened when he was just a young man starting his career. We go back several decades in time. Owen is a very skilled navigator who is waiting for his chance to be a captain and command his own ship. He is with his wife, who is pregnant with their first child and seems very excited to go on their next voyage, although his wife is worried that something might go wrong. However, when he goes to talk to the businessman, Owen discovers that his plans have been postponed. He will be the first mate on this mission, not the captain. The Essex ship would be commanded by George, an inexperienced young man, but who was the next successor of the wealthy Pollard family, famous for their whaling expeditions in search of whale oil, which was the fuel used at the time. Due to the high demand, the businessmen responsible for this industry were very well off financially. Owen is very uncomfortable having to subordinate himself to a first-time navigator who had nothing but a surname, but he receives a counter-proposal. If he returned with 2,000 barrels of oil, he could command his next voyage. Owen isn't very confident that the businessmen will keep their promise, but, with nothing to lose, he agrees to board the Essex alongside George, who immediately shows that he doesn't like Owen very much. Traditionally, the captain chooses his first mate, and being denied this right was a blow to George's ego. Finally, the ship is launched into the sea. Everything seems to be going well at first, despite the tension between Owen and George, but it doesn't take long for the first problem to appear on the high seas. As soon as the crew members hoist the auxiliary sails, the first mate spots a huge and dangerous storm approaching. That's where the first problem begins. Owen asks the crew to lower the sails and reduce speed, but George immediately disagrees. The first mate tries to explain that the storm seemed aggressive and that it wasn't a good idea to go there so fast, as they risked shipwrecking, but the captain wants to continue. For him, the crew needs to learn to work in these conditions and that a little rain shouldn't scare sailors. We see that Owen even wants to argue, but unable to do anything, he stops arguing and asks the crew to prepare. As expected, the storm is overwhelming and requires a lot of effort to keep the boat intact and upright. The captain seems a little impressed by the violence of the sea, but just watches as Owen tries to resolve the situation. Later, when they manage to overcome the danger, George calls his first mate and says that he didn't like being contradicted in front of the entire crew. Owen is almost fired, but manages to convince the captain that the best thing to do was to return with 2,000 barrels of oil as soon as possible, so that they could get rid of each other as quickly as possible. Reluctantly, George agrees to continue working with Owen. Meanwhile, Thomas recalls his own emotions at that moment, showing his surprise and discomfort at having to go through all that. It took 3 months for the crew at sea to find the first whale, which seems like a stroke of bad luck, but everyone was very excited when the first tails appeared on the ocean surface. They then follow the standard protocol for hunting whales. The first step is to lower the boats into the sea equipped with long ropes and harpoons. The men row bravely to where some whales are, and on one occasion, Owen shows the animals to young Thomas and explains what they are looking for: the calf, the mother, and the big male, which is the one that's worth money. It wasn't very difficult for Owen to hit the great male sperm whale. After being wounded, the huge animal dives at an impressive speed, and the meters of rope attached to the harpoon start to be pulled from the boat. The sailors are concerned about the rope running short, but Owen assures them that everything is under control. He makes a splice to increase the length of the cable, and when it seems that even that won't be enough, the whale suddenly stops advancing towards the bottom of the ocean. The crew is surprised. A few seconds of tense confusion hang in the air until the body of the sperm whale appears floating on the surface. The men explode in celebration before hauling the carcass onto the Essex's deck, and the oil extraction begins right there. Large blocks of fat are placed to melt. On the other hand, the crew is having trouble getting into the animal. Thomas, the smallest of them, is summoned to enter the whale's blowhole to fill buckets with fat. According to Owen, the real gold was down there, struggling to contain the desire to vomit. After all, it's visible that the situation is not pleasant, with the smell of death. Thomas descends and does what he was asked to do. With that done, the ship sets sail and circumnavigates South America to reach the Pacific Ocean, where theoretically they could find more whales. However, after almost a year at sea, they barely encountered any marine animals, and the relationship between the captain and the first mate worsened even more because of it. With George locked in his cabin most of the time and the hold almost empty, the crew knew the journey would still be long. After searching in vain for so long, the Essex docked in Ecuador, giving the sailors a little rest there. George talks to another whaler who gives him the exact location of where he could find a true whale paradise, 1,000 leagues along the equator. According to reports, it was a place with so many hundreds of whales that they wouldn't even have where to put so much oil. But of course, paradise wouldn't come for free. The local whaler tells them that a specific whale lived there, a single white and violent male, capable of attracting entire boats and never allowed fishing in that region. The whaler tries to warn about the danger, but the Essex crew can't believe the story is so grim. Ignoring the warnings they received in Ecuador, they decide to embark once again and head for this whale paradise. For the first time in a long time, the captain and the first mate agree on something. If they reach that place and find that huge amount of sperm whales, they will return with a full deck and can have peace. However, as they sailed to the indicated place, some small disagreements began among the crew. Even with the possibility of it being just a silly story, most of them are not comfortable going to the lair of a bloodthirsty whale, as the whaler who told the horrors of the whale seemed quite traumatized and convinced of the horrors it could commit. Even so, George and Owen remain steadfast in their goals and continue to sail at full speed. Shortly after, they spot the first whales, as promised, hundreds of tails covering the water's surface. The whalers lower their boats into the sea once again, excited about the abundant hunt that awaits them, and begin rowing towards the animals. They hit 1 or 2 sperm whales in no time and are so excited that they don't notice the monster approaching beneath them. A huge white sperm whale, covered in marks from other fights, approaches and hits one of the boats with its tail, knocking the whalers over and showing its grandeur, forcing the group to return to the Essex. However, the Essex was also having its problems, as the whale must have realized that its main target was not just a small boat. It attacks the ship with such force that it destroys everything, causing leaks in the collected oil and setting fire to the Essex. The remaining crew enters the remaining boats, taking what they could save. It takes some time for the men to settle in the remaining boats and start to understand what happened. They have only a few minutes to watch their ship burn and sink and then row away. When they are far enough to think better about what happened, some pertinent and frightening questions begin to arise: how they will survive with so little water and food, and how they will know where they are going when the compass and everything else was lost with the Essex, and question the fact that they won't find a place fast enough. George has no answers to most of the questions, so he tries to maintain his composure and calmness in front of his crew, but he is visibly shaken and feeling guilty. Time passes, and the sailors sail for weeks on end, exhausted and hungry. When it seems like there is no more hope, one of the crew members spots land. They are already so weak and debilitated that they don't have the strength for a big celebration, so they concentrate the little energy they have on rowing to the island they found, which served as a temporary relief. Suddenly the great whale follows them and attacks, destroying the boats one by one, killing some men and leaving others wounded with its surprise attack. After the animal leaves, the men crawl through the sand, too tired to walk, and eat bird eggs they find along the way. They catch fish with their bare hands and eat their flesh while it's still alive. After recovering a bit, the survivors light a small fire, hoping for a passing ship to spot them. The problem is, a few days later, while exploring the island, Owen finds several skeletons of sailors who, like them, were also waiting for rescue. The truth hits them overwhelmingly: they were in a region too far away to be lucky enough to be found by a passing ship. If they didn't leave there, they would die there. So, some of the men decide to return to the boats and try their luck at sea, while others want to stay on the island and wait. Owen didn't want to leave his men behind and, therefore, promises to send a rescue ship as soon as he returns to the United States. The film shows more uncomfortable scenes at sea, showing how the men slowly wither, losing strength and hope, far from home. A new commotion begins when they realize that one of them died there, on the boat, and instead of letting the body be thrown overboard, Owen actually regrets it, saying that a sailor would never get rid of something that could save his life. He says that his fellow sailors' death could save them. So he encourages the men to eat the flesh of their dead friend. Remembering this, Thomas comments that he was very afraid of dying that way, in that situation, and wondered if he would be the last to die, seeing all his colleagues depart before eating their organs until he himself had no resources left other than to die of starvation or dehydration. At that moment, remembering the horrible things he did to survive, Thomas also comments that he would never be able to tell his wife about these atrocities, imagining that she wouldn't love him if she knew he had eaten human flesh. What the man didn't expect was that his wife was listening, and she interrupts his story to say that she would love him anyway, because he was a good man despite everything. After the consolation, Mrs. Nickerson asks her husband to continue his story. Herman Melville is still listening attentively, taking notes in his notebook, and seems ready to hear the rest of the adventure. So, Thomas composes himself and continues the narrative. 71 days after they left the island, they are still a long way from the mainland and begin to wonder if they can survive long enough. Resources are so scarce that they draw lots to decide who should die next and feed his flesh to the others, and this time the captain would have lost the bet. He hands the gun to his cousin, who has been sailing with them since the beginning, and asks him to do the job. The boy refuses, but George insists and says that if the cousin couldn't do it, he should pass the gun to someone who had the courage to kill him. The boy raises the gun, puts the barrel to the captain's head, but at the last moment decides to shoot himself in the head, freeing George from this horrible fate. The act is shocking to all of them, who despite the hunger still try to help the boy, but there is nothing to be done. The best option is to enjoy the flesh, since the boy was so generous. To the surprise of those who remain alive, shortly after their colleague's death, they see the dangerous white whale, which is still following them. Owen immediately grabs a harpoon from the boat, driven by hatred, and seems ready to kill the sperm whale, but for some reason changes his mind when he realizes that it no longer appears to be a threat. Then the whale leaves them alone and almost dead at sea and returns to its territory, so the group continues the journey. Some boats were lost along the way, and men died from hardships or had to die to ensure the lives of others, and thus half a dozen men returned to port. In the end, the journey that lasted about 3 or 4 years comes to an end when the small group is rescued by ships near the American coast. The group is greeted by a crowd but has nothing to show for it, except for having survived the arduous journey. Owen is greatly relieved to find his wife among the crowd watching the survivors return, and he is even happier to meet his daughter for the first time. After seeing his little daughter, it seems like everything will go back to normal, but the business owners call George and Owen for an emergency meeting. There, they are informed that both must testify about the Essex shipwreck and are instructed to say that the ship ran aground only in an accident. George is instructed to accept the request. After all, he is part of the family of leaders. However, Owen firmly says that he will not lie, no matter how much the truth may disrupt the industry's business, and says that the huge whale destroyed the Essex, and that was the only truth that needed to be told. Before leaving, he turns to the captain and advises him to tell the truth as well, as a way to honor the names of the companions who died in the disaster. George remains silent, but shortly thereafter, when invited to testify, he tells the truth and causes a great commotion among the businessmen. Still, he has a clear conscience. Before leaving forever, Owen gives Thomas one of the whale's teeth as a memento of the journey and to congratulate him for his bravery during the mission. Owen gets his own boat to command and moves his family elsewhere, choosing to live a less dangerous life. Back in the present, Melville finally managed to understand the whole story and takes on the task of transcribing this story onto the pages of his book, honoring the brave travelers of the Essex whaling ship.